One of the most important issues internationally at the moment is the conflict in Syria, the civil war there that is spilling over into adjacent countries at this point in time. It's a major, major event. However, we have just asked Americans how closely they are following the situation in Syria, and perhaps not surprisingly, based on what we have seen historically, we have a below average percent of the American public who are following it closely. In fact, that number, which you see there in front of you on the screen, is 49% of Americans who are following it closely. That is actually below the 60% average that we have for following hundreds of news stories that we've tested using this question going back for decades. Now, I say not surprising because our data show that the average American generally doesn't pay a lot of attention on a relative basis to international events until they really flare up, something, for example, like our war in Iraq or the Vietnam War or situations along those lines. We did follow up, however, and ask the American public a couple of questions that we've asked about events previously. One of them is, do they believe that the events in Syria can be solved using diplomatic means? And the answer there is 27% say yes, using only economic and diplomatic efforts. That's the exact way we phrased it. 58% said no, they didn't think so, and then another 16% didn't have an opinion on that issue. Given that Americans are pessimistic then about economic and diplomatic efforts to solve the situation, the conflict in Syria, the question has come up and may come up in the future in the actual real world. What about the U.S. involving itself militarily in trying to solve the conflict? Obviously, the U.S. was involved to some degree in the situation in Libya, and prior to that, the U.S. has been involved in Afghanistan and Iraq and a lot of countries in recent years, including Somalia, for example, if you go back that far. So it's not out of the question that the U.S. could get involved militarily, but the average American really pulls back from that idea. Overall, 24% say yes, the U.S. should attempt to end the civil war in Syria through military means, but that leaves 68% who say no and another 8% who say they don't have an opinion on that issue. Some differences, but not a lot by political party. Republicans slightly more likely than Democrats to say that the U.S. should be involved militarily, but as these things go, that is by partisan difference standards, it's small, 31% of Republicans and 20% of Democrats. So nobody, at least a majority of none of the major groups we look at, support military intervention in Syria at this point. I would say the two bottom line takeaway points from this survey: one, Americans aren't following the situation in Syria all that closely, and two, there's a strong majority sentiment at this point that the U.S. shouldn't be involved militarily in trying to solve the civil war in that country. I'm Dr. Frank Newport, Gallup Editor-in-Chief.